and the Muslims will go to war with you, and they were very resistant to the gospel. And when the modern Christian missionary movement began, they went to Burma, they went to India, and they went to China. They sailed all around the Muslim world and just ignored it because there was no success in working with Muslims. If you want to read a book that talks about a lot of statistics, a really good book is A Wind in the House of Islam by David Garrison. It was published in 2012. And he uses the figures of 1,000 baptisms or 100 churches started in 20 years or less as minimum numbers to describe a significant number of Muslim people converting to faith in Christ. And with that as his base for how, Muslim movements to Christ, what he ends up with is from the time of the death of Muhammad until about 1850, there was not one significant movement of Muslim background people to Christ. And Muslims conquered a whole lot of Christian territory. And again, if we're going to understand the Muslim mindset, we have to understand that to them, they have been conquering Christian territory since 700 AD, and it just keeps going, and in their mind, they're invincible, and it's never going to stop. The first modern movement of Muslims to Christ is from about 1850 to 1924. I'm going to call him Sadrach Surapranata. And his followers led between 10 and 20,000 Javanese Muslims to Christ, using an approach that was so harmonious with native customs and culture that it aroused opposition from more traditional church ministries. And this is an interesting part of the story about what's happened. This guy was a Christian, but he said, churches are putting up all sorts of barriers for Muslims to come to Christ because they're demanding that they adopt Western ways of doing church. Okay? And when he started his movement, he was attacked by the Dutch missionaries in Java as basically being cultic. Now, he did some really weird things according to their way of thinking. And we could get into some of these and have a lot of fun with them. But number one, weird thing he did. He encouraged people to come into the church building to take their shoes off before they came in. But then that's what a Muslim does when they go to a mosque. He encouraged all the women to wear head coverings. And he actually had the men and older boys sit on one side of the building and the women and children sit on the other. You know what's really interesting about all of those innovations? That's what the early church did. And the problem, a major part of the problem with evangelizing Muslims has always been, it's been Western Europeans primarily who have tried, and they have brought Western European culture as part of the package, and the Muslims have rejected the package, not necessarily who Jesus is. Okay, the second one, and we're talking about from 700 AD, this is only the second one, from 1896 to 1920, Sheikh Zacharias was responsible for about 7,000 former Muslims being baptized after coming to faith in Christ in Ethiopia. Again, a major thing. But then it gets really interesting. In the 1990s, two people movements started in Iran, one each among the Berbers in Algeria, among Azerbaijani, I never can pronounce that right, Kyrgyz and Kazakh peoples in the former Soviet Union, in Albania and Bulgaria, in the Sahel, in West Africa and Bangladesh. So there are two, from 700 to 1990. There are about 10 from 1990 to 2000. And then this is a direct quote from the book. In only the first 12 years of the 21st century, an additional 69 movements to Christ of at least 1,000 baptized Muslim background believers or 100 new worshiping fellowships have appeared. That is incredible, okay? You look at the curve and it's sort of like this, and then all of a sudden it just goes like that. And that book was written in 2012. The number of Muslim background believers has continued to increase since 2012. It's estimated that Algeria has 380,000 Muslim background believers. Ethiopia, about 400,000. Iran, they estimate the number of Muslims who have converted to Christ at about 500,000. In 1979, there were 500.
That's when the Shah was.
That's church growth. Indonesia, they estimate, has 6,500,000 Muslim background believers today. Gene Miller used to talk about, they call Indonesia a Muslim majority nation, and he says, but they haven't taken a census for a while, and the Mennonite missionaries or Mennonite churches have a big baptism in the capital every year, and it's usually between 1,000 and 2,000 people being baptized at one time. I want to read this. It's white on black. I'll have trouble reading it. The names have been changed for security purposes, and I can't give it to you, but I know the guy who established the mission, and this is good stuff. I was born into a Muslim family, educated in an Islamic school, and became an imam in the local mosque. While studying the Quran, I discovered that Jesus had no sin in his life. Jesus, not Muhammad, was going to be my mediator before God on Judgment Day. God used this truth to draw me to Christ. In 1986, although I had not yet read the Bible, I began to meet other followers of Jesus and decided to be baptized. The pastor who baptized me told me, "Tell your family and friends that you've become a Christian. To follow Jesus, you must stop wearing your Muslim cap and robe and shave off your beard." I'm not exactly sure what verse of the Bible that is. I did what my pastor told me. My mother said, "You can be a Christian, but don't tell people. Continue to dress like a Muslim." But I didn't follow my mother's advice. I welcomed persecution for the cause of Christ. Sure enough, people in my community threatened to kill me. I was forced to flee for my life, but while I was gone, a group of men came to my house and killed my younger brother, who was only 13. I had just led him to Christ. Although I grieved his death, I was not deterred. I became very active in sharing my faith and saw many young people come to the Lord. They too faced great persecution. Our pastor told them to rejoice when they suffered for Jesus. He prayed for them, but didn't lift a finger to help them deal with the pain and suffering they were facing. As a result, many of these new believers turned back to Islam and became enemies of Christ. This broke my heart. It seemed like much of my effort was in vain. One day my wife told me that if I wanted to make followers of Christ, I had to show them that I loved them and was one of them. Only then would they listen. After lots of prayer, I decided to start an insider movement. Now, instead of calling myself a Christian, I call myself a follower of Jesus. And Isi, Jesus, is all over in the Quran. Now I pastor a network of house churches that reaches out to Muslims. As we befriend people, we show them what the Quran says about Jesus. When the time is right, we show them what the Bible says about Jesus. We dress in traditional Muslim garb and respect the Muslim cultural practices. Now that I've changed my ministry approach, I can live in my hometown where my brother was killed. My best friend who wanted to kill me when I became a Christian is now a believer. And another man who threatened to peel the skin off my body to make his shoes if I ever mentioned Jesus' name is now a pastor too. I credit God for all that he is doing through this insider movement. At the same time, it is a great honor to be a small part of what God is doing. And the country is Bangladesh. And if you look it up, there aren't supposed to be any Christians there. The same mission organization talks about having 20 or 30 at least disciple-making groups that have Christians in Bangladesh. And what's exciting about what's going on is the church has seemingly learned a lesson. And I think there's something for all of us in this. When the first Gentiles were saved, there were Jewish people that said they can't follow Jesus unless they become Jews. The church met, Acts 15, and they said, no. Anybody can follow Jesus. They don't have to become a Jew. When Gentiles became the majority, Gentiles began expecting Jews to become Gentile-like when they accepted the Jewish Messiah. And when they did that, conversions among Jews declined to almost nothing. Moish Rosen used to say, and he started saying in about 1970, there have been more Jews come to faith in Jesus as their Messiah in the last 50 years than in the last 1,500. It was true when he started saying it, and it's still true today. But the difference was the whole concept of letting Jews be Jews and follow Jesus. I was taught in the church I went to in high school that if a Jew accepted Christ, they shouldn't keep the Passover, they shouldn't observe any of the feasts, they shouldn't do any of that.
Why not?
Well, they used the book of Galatians and they said, well, obviously, Paul is saying you shouldn't do that stuff. No, Paul's writing to Gentiles. He's saying Gentiles shouldn't do that stuff.
Who was it written to, yeah.
And the point is, one of the biggest hindrances to the spread of the gospel among all sorts of people groups is we tend to take our culture rather than just the message of Jesus. I had a missionary teacher in Bible school who was a missionary in Paraguay, and he talked about a church that established a mission organization that led maybe 40, 50 people to Christ in Paraguay. And then they sent a team down and they built a nice brick church building with wooden pews. And the people felt like, well, that's where we have to worship. And when they outgrew that building, they didn't know what to do. And this missionary talked about working in a tribal group of people that when he left, they had 100 churches, most of whom he'd never been to, and they were meeting in basically grass huts, you know. They were meeting in something that people could build, how they built their houses, and they didn't have any need for any Western things. And this has been one of the major issues, and it's been a major issue with Muslims, that Western missionaries have brought culture. Okay, now, just think about it from a Muslim point of view. These people come from the United States, that is the world's foremost exporter of pornography, that legitimizes gay marriage and homosexual and lesbian relationships, and tell them you need to convert to our religion and become moral. You know, they find it very easy to reject us. And then we insist that they do church like we do, even though there's no biblical basis for it. And what's happened is with these insider movements, and there are a lot of them going on and they're hard to get figures for, is they are people who are just talking about Jesus. And they're starting from the Quran. In the Quran, Jesus is Isi, I-S-I. And the New Testament is, I think, Injil, I-N-J-I-L. And Muhammad says it's from God. And Muhammad says that Moses is a prophet from God and Jesus is a prophet from God. And the apostles were people sent by God to tell people the truth. And you read all of that, and he doesn't have anything negative to say about the New Testament other than he denies basic doctrines that he obviously didn't understand. And those groups that are being successful are starting with the Quran, taking the stuff in the Quran that talks about Jesus, and then saying, I follow Jesus. Who's going to come back, Muhammad or Jesus? According to the Quran, it's Jesus. Who's going to rule the world? According to the Quran, it's not Muhammad, it's Jesus. Who was sinless? According to the Quran, it's not Muhammad, it was Jesus. Oh, don't you think you want to know something about Jesus? And then, when they're open, they go to the gospel. Okay, so what has all of this got to do with what's going on in the world today? Well, what has it got to do with the Palestinians, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Hamas, the government in Iran? Muslims have what I would call an Old Testament mindset. Remember when Balak wanted Balaam to curse Israel? And Balaam said, I can't curse them, they're blessed. But before he left, he told them how to defeat them. You get them to sin and God will take them out and you won't have to. And 32,000 people died in the plague, okay? Well, Muslims look at themselves as God's people. And they look at themselves as invincible. They are totally convinced that they will one day control the world. they are, for the most part, until recently, convinced that no true Muslim ever converts to another religion. My brother was a professor at Virginia Tech, and he always had a Bible on the corner of his desk to invite questions until they told him he couldn't. Then he retired. But he was talking to a young Muslim, and he said, "Do Muslims ever convert to Christ?" And the guy said, "No, it's never happened. People make up stories, but it's never happened." And David said to him, "Well, what would you do if one did?" "Oh, we'd kill him, but it never happens." They are convinced that they're invincible, that they will take the world, that history is on their side, that they have been conquering territory ever since 700 AD. They still are. It's never going to stop. And so if you read the Hamas manifesto, this plays into it. So they believe that no one will convert. Well, people are converting all over the place. And you can see writings by Muslim leaders acknowledging that people are converting. And it's interesting, in Iran, when they ask why are they converting, they say the Ayatollahs. If this is Islam, we don't want it. Okay? They believe that once a country is conquered by Islamic armies, it will remain Islamic until the end. This is a core belief. And it's not true. And it's never really been true since the Crusades. But if you read the Hamas document and other writings by Muslims, they will say, well, there have been a couple exceptions. You know, that guy that was president of Iran, I can't pronounce his name, Ahmadinejad or something. Somebody asked him what it would take for them not to be hostile to the United States. He said, give us back Spain and Portugal. Yeah, that's probably not going to happen, okay? But they believe that once a country is conquered, it will remain Muslim until the end. And during the Crusades, the Crusaders took back Spain, Portugal, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, the southern part of Italy. The Ottoman Empire conquered Greece, held it for 200 years, lost it during World War I. So it's not true. But if you read what Hamas says, the illustration they have is that Christians tried to take back Jerusalem. And they held it for 30, 40 years, but then we got it back. And now the Crusaders, and that's what they're calling us for supporting Israel, but now the Crusaders have taken part of our territory that belongs to Allah. But it's only a matter of time until we take it back and wipe them out, okay? So that's their mindset. Now, how do they look at losing territory to Israel? Well, there's only two real things they can think. And I want you to think with me, and I want you to talk about this if you need to. A simple definition of truth is that which conforms to reality. And I've already said some of this stuff. And I want to pass these out. Nick is my great assistant here. There you go. I sort of got ahead of the notes. But truth is that which conforms to reality. And in the last 100 years or so, there have been two major areas in which what Muslims believe has not conformed to reality in very significant ways. When I started thinking about teaching this class, I asked myself, what would I do if, and I don't believe it's going to happen, but what would I do if the Palestinians eradicated Israel? It would require some major, major soul searching. Well, you've got Muslims with two very deeply held beliefs. One, that no one ever really converts, and two, that no territory they conquer will ever become anything other than a Muslim nation. And what you've got going on is the creation of the nation of Israel in an area that had been under Islamic control since the 8th century, except for a brief interval during the Crusades. Jewish people who rejected both Jesus, the Messiah, and Islam's prophet Muhammad have defeated Muslim armies in spite of overwhelming odds, time and time again. Wait a minute. They believe, and you can see it all over in their writings, once they conquer something, it's theirs to the end of time. And there's Israel. And this is something they conquered in 700 something, okay? And they've held it except for a few years during the Crusades. And as far as they're concerned, it's theirs more than any other territory on earth except Saudi Arabia. And there's Israel. And to them, if Israel continues to exist, a major truth tenet of their faith has been proven false. Okay? Now, when you read Ezekiel, starting in chapter 34 through the end of chapter 39, there is a phrase, and you will see it over and over again. Then they will know that I am the Lord. And frankly, what I see God doing is saying, okay, there are two major competing belief systems in the world right now. There's Christianity, which is based on the Bible, and there's Islam, which is based on the Quran. According to Muhammad, according to the teaching of the Quran, the whole area that is now Israel will be Muslim forever until Jesus comes back, which sounds really interesting. But no, basic fundamental belief. According to the Bible, the land belongs to Israel. God removed them once, brought them back. God was going to remove them again. And in the last days, he was going to bring them back. And there was no way anybody was going to stop it. So what you have is a clash of two world religions, a clash of two major worldviews, and it's being played out in the nation of Israel today. People will look at this and say, well, you know, the fastest growing religions in the world are probably atheism and agnosticism, and frankly, that's not true. You look at secular research. Two fastest growing religions are Islam and Christianity. And Islam is growing largely by conquest. Christianity is growing largely by conversion. And if you look at the entire world, the two fastest declining belief systems are atheism and agnosticism. Now, we don't see that in the United States, and that's because the church has been wimpy, but I'm not going to go on it. Okay. So what we've got is Israel as a nation, and then in 1967, they took Jerusalem. Now, according to current Muslim theology, Jerusalem is the third holiest city. First is Mecca, second is Medina, and third is Jerusalem. According to them, Muhammad ascended to heaven from Jerusalem, although Jerusalem isn't named, they believe that's where it was. Now, has it always been the third holiest city. And, they talk about the Mosque of Omar. The Mosque of Omar was almost destroyed by earthquakes 2 or 3 times, and they didn't rebuild it for 30 or 40 years. It didn't really become the third holiest site in Islam until the Jews moved in. And then all of a sudden, it was the third holiest site. And what's going on the Temple Mount? And the politics of this are fascinating. But the Jews control Jerusalem. But in order to prevent rioting, they allow Jordanian, I believe it is, police to patrol the Temple Mount. Because they know it'll start a war if they don't. But Jesus said, Jerusalem shall be trampled under feet until the times of the Gentiles are up. As a Gentile, I've always sort of felt about that verse, but yeah, it's what's happening. You wanted to ask something?
I have a comment to make. I read on a news brief on Israel, the Iron Dome intercepted, I don't know, 2 or 3 rockets or whatever. They were incoming to the Dome of the Rock that Hamas had sent in, and Israel took those rockets out and defended it. Kept it from being blown to pieces. So that was pretty commendable.
They went.
Well, yeah, it makes sense because it's politically expedient, among other things, to protect that dome.
Well, if they would have allowed it to be, if they would allow those rockets to come in and be destroyed,
blamed for
they
it.
would get blamed for it anyhow, yeah.
Well, they got
So-
blamed for the hospital that was bombed by Hamas.
Exactly.
So-
But I just thought that was interesting where you mentioned it,
Yeah, Hamas has a habit of
but that just happened.
shooting rockets from schools and hospitals and mosques and yeah. Okay. So number 1, you've got Israel there. And then number 2, you've got Jerusalem under Jewish control. Really for the first time since the Crusades. And they find that basically intolerable. And what's been going on, and I'm not sure I agree, but what's been going on is the right-wing part of Netanyahu's government has been insisting that Jews should be allowed to go on the Temple Mount to pray. And the Muslims are saying, no, that's sacrilege. You can't pray on the Temple Mount. And every time they do, there's a riot of some sort, either in Jerusalem or someplace else. But the whole fact that Jews can actually go on the Temple Mount is horrendous in terms of the Muslims. And then large numbers of Muslims converting to Christ, in spite of the threat of death, is incomprehensible. I refer to that student who just said to my brother, it never happens. It never happens. And Dave started giving him an examples, and he kept saying, it never happens. Well, it does. And it really started around 1850. And that's really interesting because we talked about, are we in the last days, and when did the last days really start? And the modern missionary movement starts around 1800 and picks up steam around 1850. And the Industrial Revolution, Daniel 12:4, transportation, speed up, hectic lifestyles, knowledge increasing, starts about the same time. Teaching of evolution and old ages starts about the same time. And the conversion of Muslims starts about the same time. And it's picking up pace. When you talk about 69 people movements since 2000, you're talking about a lot of stuff going on. There are 2 major people movements going on in Libya right now. And they're sending missionaries to other Berber groups in other countries. and the conversion numbers are incredible. And yeah, I don't know exactly how to do all of this, but Peter quotes Joel in the Sermon on the Day of Pentecost, and the sermon has, your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. And that's one of the things that's going on in the Muslim world. A few of you probably remember Scott and Donna Wilson. And we supported them for a number of years. His parents were founding members of the church. And her father, I believe, was a missionary in Pakistan. And he wrote a book about his time there, and he made the statement that he could not remember any conversions, or only one or two, that a dream of Jesus explaining the message to them was not part of the conversion story. And I read this in a magazine, and I had to laugh when I read it. It was, and I'm pretty sure it was Morocco, I'm not sure. But a Muslim man had a dream one night. Jesus came and explained who he was and everything. And he woke up the next morning and committed his life to Christ. And then he said, do I dare tell anybody? And he agonized it, I think, for a week and maybe two. And finally he decided, I have to. And he started talking to the other men in the village and found out he was the last one to have a dream. And everybody else had already converted. And that kind of stuff is going on. And so when you look at the claim that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, there is an underground church that maintains a Muslim identity but follows Jesus that I don't think is getting counted. So what's going on with that is really interesting. So how do Muslims respond to this? Well, if you believe something as part of your belief system, as part of your religion, and it becomes obviously true that it's not true, as a Muslim, they've really got two choices. And the first one is Islam simply isn't true. And that is happening, and that's part of what's going on. And this is one of the many factors leading to the significant number of Muslims considering the claims of Jesus. A Muslim will say, I have believed this all my life, and it's not true. Is there anything else I'm believing that isn't true? And then, well, the Christians say that the land belongs to Israel and Israel's there. Could they be right? That's one of the things that's going on. Now, the second thing they can do is this. They can say Allah is angry with Muslims because they have compromised with those who do not believe in Allah and have failed to follow the clear instructions in the Quran.
I'm sorry, where are these examples of cooperation?
Any nation that does not consider itself to be at war with any nation that is not Muslim is cooperating in Hamas's point of view.
Okay.
If you read the Hamas charter, they reject the United Nations decision to make Israel a nation. They reject the Balfour Declaration. They reject the Oslo Accords, the two-state solution. And they say they reject the Palestinian Authority, essentially, because they call them compromisers. They say, in essence, that to be a true Muslim, you have to be at war. You have to be involved in jihad. I think Brian Kilmeade was the one who wrote a book about the first war on terror, but it was about the Tripoli pirates. And it's in the first 15, 20 years of the United States, merchant ships from this country were going into the Mediterranean, and Muslim privateers from Tripoli were attacking the ships, seizing the cargo, and telling the crew that they could either convert or become slaves or die. And finally, the United States said, no, we're done with this, and we decided we needed a navy. And we created a navy and sent it over there, and they started bombarding Tripoli. And when they met to talk about a peace agreement, the position of the people from Tripoli was this: we are a Muslim nation. It is our duty to conquer any non-Muslim. You are a Christian nation. It is your duty to conquer any nation that is not Christian. There can be no peace treaty because of our religions. We are at war, and there's no other thing that can happen. And if you ever see in an article by somebody who's mad at Christians, well, it says in a document that we are not a Christian nation, that's where they pull it from. Because the negotiators from the United States said, in that sense, we are not a Christian nation. We are not a nation that feels that it is obligation to convert people to Christianity by force. In that sense, we are not a Christian nation. We're not a Christian nation in the sense that you're a Muslim nation. But if you follow the Quran, it is the duty of any Muslim nation to spread Islam by force. And when a Muslim nation stops doing that, they are compromisers. And the Hamas manifesto, there's two versions, 1988, and they diluted it a little bit in 2017, but it still has the basic stuff in it. That's the duty of every Muslim nation. So if you are not at war with a nation that's a Christian, you're a compromiser as far as they are concerned.
So what is the benefit of being a Muslim if it is your duty to be agitated and warlike at all times?
You can be agitated and warlike all times.
But I mean, what is,
Ego booster, you know.
well, to be right, to be so very right, yeah.
I think their only benefit that they're looking at is they think then they're gonna be in heaven, you know, they'll be,
Well,
whatever
Doesn't
their
that,
Yeah,
idea
right.
is.
doesn't that hang by a thread though? They have an awful lot of rules they have to.
Mhm.
well, if you die in jihad, they pretty much say you're going straight to heaven. And before you get after them too much, the Orthodox Patriarch of Russia has promised Russian soldiers that they die in Ukraine, they go to heaven. I mean, it's that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But for them, how do I say this and not be totally wrong in my attitude? But I remember talking to Don Burns once, and he said, Islam is a really easy religion for a man. It's not for a woman, but for a man, it's a really easy religion. You got to say prayers 5 times a day. You got to go to Mecca once if you can. But you can lie, you can steal, you can beat up your wife. If a guy's a non-Muslim, you can even kill him, and you haven't done anything wrong.
A
And
lot of freedom there, isn't it?
now, if you're a woman, it's a whole different story.
Right, and when I took a world religion class, and I was saying, why do women buy into this at all?
Yeah.
And the teacher's answer was, well, they don't have a choice. But I was wondering, with computers everywhere, yes, they use them to organize and stuff, but the women are also given a taste of freedom that they don't really want them to have in terms of being able to see outside their little world.
Well, okay, we talked about probably the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran. Okay, from 500 to 500,000, yeah, that's church growth. The church is predominantly women, okay? And it gets sort of interesting in terms of, okay, who are the elders or eldresses and all of that, and I'm not even going to try to figure that out. I'm just going to say that in a lot of contexts, the gospel will appear to the Muslim women first, because their life under Islam is basically horrible. Now you've got a nation like Saudi Arabia that is, I mean, they've modernized. They'll let women drive cars. It's incredible what's going on there.
Yeah, wasn't there a period like in the 50s, in the 1950s, where in Iran, women were wearing Western fashion and
Yes,
running amok?
Under the Shah.
Under the Shah.
It was gone, like.
Yeah.
yeah, and when they rebelled against the Shah, the Ayatollahs moved in and took over, and then they imposed a form of Islam that hadn't been seen nationally in years. Now the Taliban has done it in Afghanistan. But if you ask someone, why is the church growing so fast in Iran, the answer they'll usually give you is the Ayatollah. If this is Islam, we don't want it. A very interesting book that Ron Jacobs gave me entitled Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. It's about a young Muslim man that came with his family to the United States. And he said, my conception of who Muhammad was much more like Jesus than like Muhammad actually was. And it wasn't until I really started digging into the Quran and seeing what he said and what he did that I began to realize that my whole conception of Islam wasn't really based on reality. And he talked about a couple of dreams he had, but it is obvious from the Quran that Muhammad let his armies rape women when they conquered a city. And if you see the phrase, the women of your right hand, that means women who've been conquered in battle and they have absolutely no rights. And this guy had a dream of his hometown being conquered by a Muslim army and women being raped. And he said, and the woman I heard screaming was my mother. And it was one of the turning points for him when he realized that this was okay according to Muhammad. And what you had in the 7th century was a very, very violent world. And what Muhammad did was so normal for that period of time that it wasn't absolutely rejected. But over the years, with the influence of Christianity on the world, a standard for how people ought to be treated has sort of permeated the world. And to go back to how Muhammad said people should be treated is reprehensible to a lot of people. And so what you have going on is you have a lot of countries where they have just basically said, we're Muslim, but we're not at war with the West. We're not going to pick a fight with the United States. That doesn't look smart. We're not going to pick a fight with Israel. That hasn't turned out all that well. We're going to try to cooperate. And one of the reasons Hamas did what they did on October 7th was they were right on the verge of a peace treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And yeah, Saudi Arabia pulled its ambassador, and there's no further discussions and all of that. In that sense, what they did was a success. But they were saying any nation that accepts Israel, any nation that is not at war with Israel, and with every Christian nation, is not following Muhammad. And so you had ISIS, and what do you see with ISIS? You saw the same thing. You saw the same tactics. You saw women being raped, sold, raped again. You saw all the kinds of violence and everything as a part of war. What do you see in Afghanistan? You see the incredible pressure against the women. You see women being abused in all sorts of ways. And it's a return to 8th century Islam. And so you've got two groups, and they're sort of getting farther apart. You've got the ISIS, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Iran, Afghanistan, Taliban group that is saying the reason that Muslims are converting and the reason the nation of Israel hasn't been exterminated is we are not following Islam the way that Muhammad taught it. And it's the Old Testament idea. If God's people obey God, they're invincible. Well, we must not be obeying God. That's why we're getting beaten. We have to go back and we have to do it the way Muhammad said. The other group of people are saying we need to accept reality. Israel's here to stay. We've tried to wipe it out 3-4 times. Every time we do, they take more land. Let's not do it again. It's not working. And there is a schism between those two groups. But when Israel went into Gaza, I don't think you can find a Muslim nation that isn't protesting Israel going into Gaza, regardless of how, quote, modern and cooperative they had become.
So, I was just thinking the other day, what's interesting about the United States, the great evil, right, isn't that what they call us? Is that the most public faces of Islam here are women representatives in the government. And those women would not even be allowed to show their faces in the Muslim country, but they're using them here.
Would they be elected to the government if Islam took over? No.
But I mean, I just thought it's interesting that they're garnering support. And of course, the big question is, where are all these feminists in the United States when you look at the way women in the Middle East are treated?
Okay, Nick, I've got another
I think
page.
it's ironic though, is if those 4 representatives were men, what would that be?
Right.
They're being used.
Yes.
As a protected class.
Right.
And I've said it before, in terms of what's going on the college campuses. One of the things I just looked at and I almost wanted to laugh and then cry was this big banner being held up as Queers for Palestine.
That kind of ignorance is deadly.
But if they went over there, they would be executed.
Right.
So there's something going on other than clear logic, okay? To understand what's going on, you have to see it from a spiritual warfare perspective. Now, if you follow what's going on, and you do realize that Vladimir Putin portrays himself as a defender of basic moral values.
He must be, he was just reelected.
Well, he hasn't been reelected yet, but everybody knows what's going to happen. But, well, they have strengthened the laws against gays, and they have strengthened the laws against abortion, and they are the defenders of morality against the corrupt West. That's been Iran's theme for years. And what you end up with is if you're against Israel and you're against Christianity, you're on the same team. And so you've got Iran and Russia becoming close allies. Now you think about that. Russia is no longer communist, but Vladimir Putin was part of the secret police under communism, and most of us have some major doubts about the sincerity of his religious professions. And yet, Iran, they're fine with them. North Korea, it's, quote, communist, but you're supposed to worship the ruling family. Really? And Iran is fine with them. And Russia's fine with them. And then you have the college campuses that are very, very, very strongly in favor of gay rights, supporting a nation that says gays should be executed. And ISIS took gays, blindfolded them, carried them up to the top of a building, and tossed them off head first. And yet they are being supported by feminist groups and by gay rights groups. And apart from the idea of spiritual warfare, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And what you have going on then is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay? Well, if you're the enemy of Israel, and if you're the enemy of evangelical Christianity, then you're friends. Even if you're on totally opposite sides of all sorts of theological and social issues. And there's no other way that this makes a whole lot of sense when you see what's going on. That's what's going on. So, remember when we get in the book of Acts and the early church, and Stephen starts preaching before the Sanhedrin, and he really calls them out, and they rush at him in a rage, drag him out, and stone him, and they lay their coats down at the feet of a young man named Saul. What happens next? There's an intense persecution of the church. Saul is a ringleader. Okay? Now, where was Saul coming from? He was a Jew. He was probably close to being accepted into the Sanhedrin. Can't prove that, it's sort of complicated, but probably. And the official version of the Sanhedrin was that Jesus' followers had stolen his body and hidden it, and then lied and said the resurrection had happened. So if you followed the Sanhedrin line, Christians were a bunch of crooks and liars, and they were teaching a false religion. And incredible persecution arose against the church. And Saul was a major part of that. And when he ran out of people that he could find in Jerusalem to arrest, he got permission from the chief priest to go to Damascus. And on the way there, Jesus appears to him, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And in one of his accounts of his testimony, he adds these words, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, most of us don't know what the goads are, so I'll explain it. I grew up on a farm and I didn't know. When you have a horse or horses pulling a wagon, you have a brake to lock the wheels, but you also need to have something to stop the horses from backing up, because you've got reins you can pull on to stop them. But if they start backing up and you want to stop them, pulling on the reins isn't going to help. So you have today it'd be a 2x4 that would go across the width of the front of the wagon. And today they probably have 16-pound penny nails through it with it sticking out about that far. And as long as the horse is pulling into the harness, there's space. But if the horse starts backing up and the goads are out, they back into those nails, which usually convinces them to stop backing up, okay? What Jesus says to Paul indicates he was experiencing a great deal of pain in what he was doing and was keeping on doing it anyway. And what that tells me is from the time of the death of Stephen, Saul was deeply conflicted. He was a very religious man. He was doing all the right stuff. He was advancing Galatians upon many of my contemporaries in the Jewish religion. And then he saw Stephen die, and it said his face shone like an angel. And he knelt down and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And he died with joy while being stoned to death. And there's Saul, Paul, looking at it, angry, bitter, we ought to kill these people. And he sees something that he doesn't have. And it made him angry. And so his initial reaction was, we got to kill these people. We got to wipe this out. This is dangerous. And he became a violent persecutor of the church. What happens when Muslims realize that the truth claims of Islam about no nation ever going back to another group or about Muslims converting to Christ? What happens when those truth claims start becoming obvious? A lot of them get angry. And a lot of them come to the conclusion, we have absolutely got to stop this. And any form of violence is acceptable. Paul was voting for the death penalty for almost everyone he arrested. That's the kind of thing that I think that's going on in the Muslim world right now. They can't reconcile what God is doing with their belief system. And so they either have to compromise or they have to go back to a radical form of Islam. And the more they go back to a radical form of Islam, the more conflict there is within Islam, because those who are not going that way say, no, that's just not going to work. People are going to reject that. There's been interesting that the leader of Saudi Arabia has sent messages to the Ayatollahs in Iran saying, you're going to destroy your country if you keep on the process you're going. You have to start giving women some rights. And the Ayatollahs have said, no way, and doubled down on what they're doing. But that kind of conversation has happened. Okay. There's another thing going on in Islam, and we need to start talking about that one too. Jesus said a house divided cannot stand. When Muhammad died in 632, Muslims split over who their next leader should be. And there was actually an awful lot of violence. The majority of his followers thought it should be Abu Bakr, the father of his favorite wife, Aisha, the one that he married when she was somewhere between 6 and 9. A smaller group believed that Muhammad's son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, should be the next leader. I guessed at that. The followers of Abu Bakr won. Now, Sunnis support the legitimacy of the first 4 caliphs. Let's see, where am I? Okay. Yeah,
Page 11 is at the very top.
yeah,
Page 11.
okay. And I got, I did something weird.
Page 11 is the same.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I did something wrong and I got one marked with the wrong number because I was writing numbers down. Okay.
So we don't have a page 11.
No,
Yeah,
no,
you do, you have a page 11, but it's 10 written over.
it's the same.
I taught most of this once before, but I've been updating it as I go, and
10 and 11 that we have here are identical. All right.
yeah, and, yeah, I've got a whole another page of stuff. Okay. So, Sunnis, Shias believe that Ali, who became the fourth caliph, was the only legitimate caliph of the first four, and that his descendants by Muhammad's daughter Fatima are the sole genuine Islamic leaders. Shia believe that the first four caliphs were all legitimately elected, and they're all legitimate. There are major differences between Shia and Sunni.
This one, need two of those.
Oh, need two of those.
You need one too?
Well, those, we need to hand them all out, I thought.
No.
We don't have these.
I have.
We got a double page 10, which has, one has 11 marked on it.
Okay, the one that has 11 marked on it is 11.
No, mine's 10, well,
Okay, most of those that have 11 marked on
the
them
one
are
that's been
11.
hand corrected as well.
Yeah, the one that's
No.
hand corrected?
It's correct. It's wrong.
It's wrong
Okay.
on ours.
Okay,
I'm looking
Here it
at
is.
10 and
That's
11,
the
it's
correct
just, they're identical across the first line.
okay. I am sorry.
That's okay, as long as we get on the same page here.
Okay, page 11, the first word should be caliphs.
All right, got it.
Okay, I'll have to throw some stuff out.
We'll
I'm
get
sorry.
there.
Can you remind, I don't remember learning what a caliph is.
The caliph would be the person who ruled the Muslim empire. Okay?
It's the Pope, the Muslim talk.
Pope, the king, the pharaoh.
Yeah, now, they were never worshipped, but they were the absolute authority. And when you look at Sunni nations and Shia nations, the Ayatollahs have a whole lot more authority in a Shia nation than a religious leader in a Sunni nation.
I have a quick question. So that is a birth, Shia and Sunni are different births.
Well, it all goes back to the first four caliphs, and the split has existed ever since. They pretty much made up when they picked the fourth caliph, and they've been living in relative harmony since then. But there are differences, and you look at Saudi Arabia, who's in charge? Well, the Saud family. And it's not the Muslim leaders, it's the Saud family. The Muslim leaders have a lot of power. You look at Iran, and the Ayatollah is the supreme leader. Now, it's a democracy, but he decides who can run. And if you decide who can run, yeah, you're pretty much in charge. And Shias really believe, and I don't think this is in the notes, Shias really believe that the Messiah, Jesus, won't come back until the world is involved in a worldwide war. And so pushing the world toward war, well, that's just going to bring the Messiah back. Sunnis don't tend to believe that. For much of the history of Islam, I'm on page 11 if it's marked correctly, they have existed side by side in relative peace. But in the last 50 years or so, conflict has intensified, although it is probable that religious differences are often an excuse for other, much more mundane motives, primarily political power or wealth. What happened to Christianity? The eastern and western part of the Roman Empire split over one word, filioque. What was that all about? Well, it was about a guy in Constantinople who wanted to be in charge of everything, and a guy in Rome who wanted to be in charge of everything. And they finally found something they could argue about. And they argued about that one word and split the empire. That means "and the Son." And the question was, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father or from the Father and the Son? And they split over filioque. But it was all about political power. That wasn't the issue. That's what's going on in the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been at odds. Now, whether they'll kiss and make up for a while or not, who knows? But it's partly because they're Sunni and Shia, but it's also largely because each one of them wants to be the biggest kid on the block. And so there's this divide in Islam, and this divide has really opened up a door for Israel. So let's talk about who's who. 85 to 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni, with 10 to 15% being Shia. Shias are a majority in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was Sunni, and Shias were persecuted when he was in power. Iran, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain are majority Shia countries. They're a politically significant minority in Lebanon. As late as 1970, Lebanon had a very stable government. It was 3 blocks. It was about 40% Maronite Christian, about 30% Shia, about 30% Sunni. Shia are the largest bloc now because they border Syria. And when ISIS started the war in Syria, they got so many refugees that Shias became the majority. And they have been very unstable ever since. And the only way they were able to get an actual government, and they went months, if not years, without having a president or anything else, was to make Hezbollah part of the government. Which, yeah, okay. So, Syria is predominantly Sunni, but the Assad family and their allies are Shia. And it's a distinct branch of Shia, Alawite Shia. Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan also have significant numbers of Shias. When you look at what's going on in Iran and when they had the protests, where were most of the people killed who protested? In the Sunni region and in the Kurdish region, because Kurds are a minority in Iran and Shia are a minority in Iran. And there's a Shia cleric who preaches every Friday against the Shia, and they don't dare take him out because he's so popular, but he keeps saying the Shia government has got to come down. And so this conflict is all over in the Muslim world right now. Hamas, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are Sunni. Hezbollah is Shia. And yet Iran supports Hamas, the PLO. They sort of supported Al-Qaeda, but they didn't support ISIS. There's all these fractures, okay? And Iran will send money to Hamas and expect Hamas to support the Houthis, who are Shia, fighting against the Sunnis in Yemen, okay? So what you've got is a really fractured Muslim world right now. Kurds make up 15 to 20% of the population of Turkey and Iraq, and 7 to 10% of the population of Iran and Syria. The lady Masa Amini that was killed in police custody was a Kurd. Would it have happened if she wasn't? Maybe not. They're discriminated against in all 4 countries. They have no country of their own, and are perhaps the world's largest stateless ethnic group.
Who is that again?
The Kurds. And the Kurds we worked with fighting against ISIS in Iraq. And then we left, and the Shia, who are the majority in the country, took over, and the Shia have persecuted the Kurds, just like Saddam Hussein persecuted the Kurds before him. For whatever it's worth,
And the Kurds are primarily what?
they're Muslim. They're primarily Sunni.
Sunni, because there's a huge group of Coptic Christians over there too, which that's a lot of, they don't get a lot of news, because they were pretty much eradicated.
Yeah, the Christian groups, the first country in the world to call itself Christian was Armenia. And what was Armenia is part of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, maybe some of Iran. Christians have been there since 50 AD, and ISIS went after them big time, destroyed a lot of the churches. But you've got the Kurds, and they're a distinct people group, and according to Turkey, they're terrorists. And yeah, and when they helped the United States, Turkey got mad because we were helping Kurds, because Kurds are a terrorist group, because they feel they're being persecuted by Turkey. And I'm not going to try to sort it all out. I'm just going to say it's splintered. It's splintered pretty bad. So ISIS, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, the government of Iran, and the Taliban are the most extreme of the movements seeking to restore a pure 7th century Islam, okay? But they're not really united. It's funny because Pakistan wanted to see the United States out of Afghanistan, but they're Sunni. And they didn't like the Shia taking control after we left. And so there's all these fracture lines. They're all over the place. And I'll give you one more and then we're done. The Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire in Daniel, it was the Medes and the Persians, but eventually the Persians came to totally dominate it. Probably ruled over a greater percentage of the world's population than any other empire. That's because they controlled India, okay? The Mongolian Empire covered a lot more territory, but in terms of population, Persia was probably the biggest empire the world's ever seen. And they tend to see themselves as the most important of the Muslim nations, okay? We ruled more of the world. They probably were ruled over more than 50% of the world's population at one time. No other government has done that. And they see themselves as the most important Muslim nation. Most other Muslim nations, predominantly Sunni, especially Saudi Arabia, see Iran as an even greater threat to themselves than Israel. So you've got Iran thinking they should be in charge of everything. You've got Saudi Arabia and the Sunnis thinking that Saudi Arabia is where Islam came from. It's where the two most holy sites are, and obviously they are the most significant nation. And why in the world was Saudi Arabia thinking about making a treaty with Israel? Because they view Iran as a bigger threat than Israel. They see Iran as determined to rule the world. They see Israel as clobbering anybody who attacks them, but never trying to start a war. So if you've got somebody who's determined to start a war with you, and somebody who will fight if you start a war with them, who are you going to line up with? And that's behind what is called the Abraham Accords and what's going on now. And they're called Abraham Accords because everybody involved in the process is descended from Abraham. Okay. Although Iran has supported Sunni groups, Hamas, Palestine Liberation Organization, and Al-Qaeda, and the Houthis, it has actively opposed ISIS, and it has expected Sunni Hamas to actively support the Shia Houthis in Yemen. And who's firing rockets at Israel right now? Okay, Hamas, which is Sunni but funded by Iran. But the Houthis in Lebanon, who are Shia, and Hezbollah in Syria that are Shia. And you talk about fractured, okay? And yeah, I gotta stop. I've run out of time. But that's what's going on. It's just all fractured. And when you see what's going on and you know who all the players are, some of the things that are happening make a lot of sense. But if you don't know where those fracture lines are, it's hard to figure out, why are they doing that? Why are Saudi Arabia and Iran fighting a proxy war in Yemen for the past 5, 6, 7 years? Yeah, they're fighting a proxy war in Yemen. That's what it is. Saudi Arabia is supporting one side, Iran supporting the other. The Houthis have fired rockets at Saudi Arabia. Yeah, it's a proxy war. So those fractures exist, and God is using them to achieve his purposes, and I gotta shut up and quit. Father, we thank you. Father, we thank you that though we live in a crazy world, your word makes sense of it. And Father, I thank you that you have said categorically, then they will know that I am the Lord. And Father, I thank you for what you're doing in Israel. You said it'd be a bloody mess when they came back, and it has been, and it is. But you said that when Israel stood, then they would know that I am the Lord. And so, Father, help us to pray into your purposes, and help us to share the truth that what you say will happen. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. And if you have an 11 that's actually a 10, give it back to me. I printed out 10, and then I said to the computer to print 10, 11, and it printed 10 again, I thought, because 10 was at the bottom.